Now, we've already talked in these classes, and right from the very beginning, where I said that everyone is a theologian. It's a big word, theologian, so it sounds kind of scary, but every single person that has ever asked a question about what is the meaning of life, anybody that's ever wondered if there is a God or not a God, or if there is a God, what's this God like? Anybody that has ever reflected upon what happens after death, anybody that has wondered about what really matters, what is the good life, any of these questions that you may have are questions of theology, questions that are thinking about particularly God and the meaning of life. That's where the word theology comes from. The word theology is reasoning about God, God reasoning. So the two words can be broken up like this. You got the word theos, which is the first part of theology. Theos is God. Logos, we also have that in the beginning of the book of John, where it talks about the logos, or the reason became flesh, Jesus. The word logos in Greek means reason. And so theology is God reasoning, reasoning about God. So everybody that thinks about God, thinks about the meaning of life, thinks about creation, or any question of ultimate significance is a question of theology. So the real thing that we have to think about for ourselves is not, am I a theologian, but what kind of theologian am I? That is the kind of question every one of us needs to reflect on. Because not all theologies are equal. And as Christians, not all Christian theologies are equal either. So today we're going to talk about 5 different categories of theology. And this is kind of a little bit fun too, because we'll probably see ourselves, especially in the first one, probably even in some of our upbringing, at least I certainly do also. And talk about where the healthy theologies lie and where the unhealthy ones lie. So the first one is what is, well, I guess I have a few other quotes here. So Christian theology then, faith-seeking understanding. A Christian theologian is one who seeks to understand their faith by studying the God who took the initiative to disclose himself. So theology, God reasoning, as I said earlier, but then what we're doing is more than just theology in the broad sense. We're doing Christian theology. So we are reflecting on our faith. We've already committed to a faith. We've committed to the Christian faith, and now we're reasoning, we're thinking through that faith. And we are believing, which is one of the foundations of the Christian faith, that it is God who initiated this whole process. God revealed himself, and now we are reflecting on his revelation of himself. This isn't something we've discovered. So that's what we're doing as Christians and what Christian theology is. But as I said before this, not all Christian theologies are equal also. Unreflected belief is what is referred to as folk theology. So this is the first of our 5 categories of theology that we're going to look at. Folk theology is an unreflected belief based on blind faith or tradition of some kind. This is the kind of thinking that goes along with the story of the daughter who was making a turkey, and what she did when she made the turkey is she cut off both ends of the turkey, and then she stuck it in the pot and then put it in the oven for making everything for Thanksgiving. And finally, someone asked her, why do you always chop 2 ends off the turkey before you put it in the oven and put it in the pot? And she says, I have no idea. My mother always did that. And so they went and found the mother and said, how come whenever it was Thanksgiving, you chopped off both ends of the turkey before you put it in the oven and cooked it for Thanksgiving? And she said, I don't know, because grandmother always did that. So then they found grandmother, and they asked the grandmother, why did you always chop off the 2 sides of the chicken before you put it into the oven? And she said, oh, it's because the pot that I had was too small. And so I always chopped the 2 sides off the chickens to stick it in the pot so that it would fit. That's what folk theology is kind of like. And so what happened is the mother and then the grandmother, they just did what grandma did, but they didn't reason or think that through or figure out why grandma did that. And so they continued on certain traditions and certain practices which no longer had any relevance for grandma or the granddaughter who now could use a bigger pot. Unreflected theology is like that. It just kind of goes along, don't question, don't think about things. And in that way, it's not even a real theology. Because remember what the definition of theology was? Reasoning about God. Well, folk theology almost denies that that should take place. And so what it does is it actually rejects critical thinking. So I grew up in a fairly conservative, you could almost say fundamentalistic tradition, especially through my high school years. And I wanted to go and be a pastor and was planning to go to a Bible school, a Baptist Bible school. And there were some people in my church that were horrified that that was going to ruin my faith. Even going to a Christian Bible school, they heard, oh, that ruins people's faith, and they lose their faith because they didn't want you to think about your faith at all, didn't want you to hear other views, didn't want you to, so you could imagine what they'd think university was like. It's a kind of a protectionistic way. It tends to enthusiastically embrace simplistic approaches to the faith. It's often practiced by cliches, bumper sticker faith, God said it, I believe it, that kind of thing. Legends often love to read books about hitchhiking angels and near-death experiences, and astronomers discovering Josiah's missing day, and crying Mary statues, faith TV healing people that maybe wore shoes like I just did, or lots of Bible self-help for the family, or how to get rich and be a Christian. There's all kinds of different branches of it, and some of it even doesn't obviously agree with other branches of it, but it is a simplistic, unreflective type of faith. It's often anti-theology, against theology. It's usually very experiential. So it bases things more on experience, and experience is important, we talked about that before, but it bases things on experience even over thinking. And so you may reason out something with them, and it doesn't matter because they're like, well, it doesn't matter, I had a vision, or I had a feeling that I was just supposed to buy this really bright green sweater because God just impressed it upon me to do that. And even if I have some theological objections to that green sweater, it doesn't matter because you felt God told you to wear it. So that's why he's wearing it. It can be quite abusive that way too. I mean, pastors can abuse that as well. I could sit in a board meeting and the board's kind of figuring out what we should do as a church, and I could say, we need to do this because God told me to. I mean, what corner have I now painted everybody on the board? You either are with me because I'm with God, or if you object to what I have to say, well then obviously you're not on God's side because God told me we need to do this. It can be very manipulative like that too. It's usually highly uninformed, based on a lot of oral traditions. It unfortunately encourages gullibility and simplistic answers, and so people get really taken advantage of. I've always wondered, I mentioned some of the TV type preachers and that, a lot of them that do this kind of thing, and all the followers, you know, you get thousands and thousands of people that send money to these people and touch their TV screens and get like, you know, holy hankies that come in the mail for them to, and I always wonder, like, do some of these televangelists, like, do they really believe what they're selling, or do they know they're complete charlatans? You wonder. And the people that they're taking advantage of, unfortunately, are people that have become gullible because they've got a simplistic theology, and a theology that is not one that they're critically examining. Unfortunately, a lot of Christian books are filled with folk theology. Folk theology sells better than good theology. I mean, how many people, if any of you bought the Mosaic of Christian Belief and just looked through that, and like that does not sell as good as 23 Minutes in Hell, which was, when they had Christian bookstores, I remember that book was in the theology section, along with some of these like other, and I'm just like, wow, so, and the guy went there for 23 minutes, came back and wrote a whole thing about it. So why do you even need the Bible? The guy he had a first-hand experience of the place. That kind of stuff sells, and you'll find it in all kinds of end times comic books and romantic fiction encounters with angels, Bible codes, the millions and millions of stories that circulate. Often Mythbusters will talk about how these stories are not true. So there's the story of the scientist that, the atheist scientist that challenged his class to prove that God existed. He was going to take this very fragile glass beaker and he was going to hold it out and drop it and it would shatter. And so he challenged anybody in the class who believed in God to stand up and pray before he did it so that it wouldn't break. And this went on for years and years, and he would mock the faith. And finally, one time, some student stood up in class and said, I believe God exists, and I challenge you. So he prayed, and on that particular occasion, for some reason, the way the professor was standing, it fell, and it hit his foot, and it didn't break. You know, and those kind of stories get told, and people love to hear them from the pulpit. The problem with them is they just never happened. They're not based in any reality, or even though they're spun on the internet, nobody can source it to an actual encounter that happened. But folk theology just loves that stuff. They don't fact check if it even ever happened. Folk theology happened pre-Reformation. This was a big part of what the Reformation was protesting against, was the folk theology, the selling of indulgences, that you could buy people ways out of hell. In fact, Martin Luther joked that relics was a big thing in that day. So he joked that if they were to gather all of the pieces of the authentic cross throughout the Roman Empire, they could have rebuilt Noah's Ark. Frederick the Wise, in his big, huge monastery-type place where he was collecting relics, had things like milk from Mary's breast. And I guess it didn't go bad. Obviously, it wouldn't. You know, she's a holy person. And then they had soot from the fiery furnace. They had all kinds of thorn from Jesus' crown. And people would pay tons of money to walk through these places like museums and to be blessed and be touched by them. This is the kind of stuff that Luther protested against as well. So that's folk theology. And probably all of us relate to some of it, not to others of it, because of the traditions that we came from, but we can certainly recognize it. I think everybody has some folk theology in them. Why theology, when you start doing it, is scary is because this is what starts to have holes be punched in it. And these can be sacred for some of us. Mom always cut the ends of the chicken off. And sometimes they can become so sentimental to us that even when it no longer is necessary, we may decide, I just want to keep chopping the ends of the chicken off, just because Mom always did it. And in some cases, that's okay, because it doesn't really affect things that much. In other cases, that's bad, which can happen in folk theology. That theology, good theology, is going to challenge some of our folk theology and possibly have us re-examine it and even throw some of it away. That's when we move into what is called lay theology. So lay theology is a healthy theology that all Christians should have. Lay theology arises when Christians dig deeply into the resources of their faith and put their mind and heart together in a serious attempt to examine and understand that faith. So it appears when ordinary Christians, like all of us here, begin to question folk theology. That's when you begin to do real healthy theology. It starts with questions. It starts with questions of all things. How can I believe that 2,000 years ago a guy actually rose from the dead? I mean, it just sounds ludicrous. Did that ever actually happen? Is there any evidence for that? Is there reasons why I should believe that? Or other types of things that I brought up before. Why should I believe that a man wearing silver shoes that sends me a cloth in the mail is going to heal me of my cancer? Should I believe that? It answers those questions. So some of those, oh, okay, I got cut off. You just have to switch cards? Okay. I'll just keep talking anyway, whether to do that too. But some of those you're going to find are going to be answered in the positive. Some of them are going to be affirmed. And so that's why we want to ask questions about that, because even things that are true need to be examined. So things like the resurrection of Christ, we need to look into that. We need to examine it. We need to have a reason for the hope that we have. Other things are going to prove to be untrue. And then we have to do the difficult thing of possibly saying, I need to throw this away. I no longer can accept this or believe this. Let me know when you want me to keep going. Okay, I'm not muted or anything? Okay, we can clean all that up after. So it begins to reason about the faith. It begins to do things like understand biblical terms. And it begins to have more awareness of history. Take, for instance, something like the term soul. Sometimes we can read modern-day definitions into a biblical understanding. And so we might read soul, and we just automatically just read some ghost that lives inside of a person that kind of escapes and floats around somewhere. And we read that into it, not recognizing that the Bible doesn't refer to soul that way. Greek philosophers do. The Bible, when it uses the word soul, it's talking about the whole person. It's talking about us holistically. And even go back 100 years or so, when people understood terms differently, language changes, that's how it was understood there. When people were stranded on an island and they wrote SOS in the sand and you flew by, did you think they were saying, please save the ghost that lives inside of my body? They didn't mean that. When they said SOS, they meant save us. And that's more of how the Bible understands it. So that's just one example how sometimes we can read things into the Bible using a modern definition and interpret a concept differently than the Bible understands a concept. So lay theology begins to try to understand, what does the Bible mean by these terms? How is Paul understanding this? How does this challenge cultural views? How do I understand the Bible in light of things that have been proven otherwise? Like last week we talked about scientific discoveries, like with Galileo and that. It begins to develop some objectivity to different views as well. It begins to understand the difference between blatant contradictions and things that are not biblical, and also things that are difficult. It begins to understand that there are certain doctrines in Scripture that are more complicated. And there are different positions that people in the church have taken. And there's more nuance to it. And they both can be Christian positions. Not that they're both right, but they both don't fall into heresy. It begins to understand some of that. It realizes in lay theology that just like when Socrates said that the unexamined life is not worth living, it begins to understand that an unexamined faith is not worth having. So this actually is an act of worship. In fact, sometimes reading things and thinking about the majesty and the distance of God, and yet the intimacy of God, and just trying to understand or even not understand that. I remember sometimes as a kid thinking about eternity and how God, it's a little bit easier for me to think about things going on and on and on and on, but trying to think about how something never started. Like it just always was there and then always there and then always there. I remember like literally getting myself into a brain freeze as a kid. I was like, "Argh!" And my friends thought I sucked on a Slurpee too quickly. And I'm like, no, I'm just thinking about eternity. Argh! Like that's worship. There's a part of worship that we forget, that worship is also about fear and trembling and being baffled by the wonder of God. If scientists, sometimes those that aren't even Christians, can be baffled just by the wonders of science and astronomy and cells and all of that, how much more should we be baffled by the things of God? So theology isn't just figuring everything out. A lot of theology is realizing there's a lot we still need to figure out, and that causes us to move into doxology, worship. But all this to be said, that this is probably the most critical move from folk theology to lay theology that there is. So the big warning here is that this is where a lot of angst can happen for people. This is where a lot of struggles, even difficulties with parents and kids. I've seen kids, they go off to Bible school and they come back and they have begun to learn deeper about their own traditions, and then their parents like freak out because they no longer hold the same end times views or something, and the parents think their kids have lost their faith, and like it causes tensions like that. I've seen people leave churches over things like this because we do communion differently, and it just totally shakes up their whole theology of the way it was always done. This is actually where a lot of tension happens, is the moving from folk theology to lay theology. And so if you're in that stage, you need to recognize, and I think I said this in the first talk too, you need to recognize that that's normal. If you're feeling this tension within you and a little bit of being discontent, that's normal. It's the same as if you are beginning to train for the Olympics and you're going to start pushing yourself beyond just playing in your backyard, and you're actually going to push yourself, and you start practicing, you should start feeling sore. You should start feeling like, man, my muscles are sore, and if you aren't, then you're not practicing very well. Some of that pain, some of that soreness is normal, healthy, and good, and it will happen as you move from a folk theology to a lay theology. Now, the next ones that are still relevant to understanding are what would be called ministerial theology. Now, the ministerial theology would be sort of more reflective of where I'm at, or what you should expect of what you would call clergy or pastors. So ministerial theology is a reflective faith practiced by trained ministers and teachers, both professional and lay, in Christian churches. Now, I'm not trying to so narrow it that parachurches shouldn't have people, but primarily churches are where you're going to find people like this. So in addition to many of the attributes of lay theologians, ministerial theologians or ministry theologians also are ones who know how to use the biblical tools and know how to use them well. So commentaries and dictionaries and concordances, and can often lead other people in their congregation that want to dig deeper into places where they can go. They can be a resource for them. They have a good historical perspective of the development of theology. They should know their own tradition well, in this context Baptist, but they should know broader than their own tradition as well. They should be able to have a keen systematic thinking that's able to recognize where there's inconsistencies among beliefs and try to bring coherence to it, which is called systematic theology. And they also should be the kinds of people that have the ability to convey this to others so that they can teach other people. They can help people to go from folk theology to lay theology and to continue to deepen their theology. So that would be what you would refer to as ministerial theology. Up a little bit more, you then got what is called professional theology. So these are the people that train me, people like me. So in professional theology, this is a vocation that involves studying the tools and writing the tools. So I go to the tools and I can use the tools and know how to access them and know how to interact with different thinkers and traditions and theologians and teach other people. But these are the people that actually put the tools together. These are the people that are translating the Bible for you. These are the people that are writing the commentaries. These are the people that are training the ones that are in our churches. Now, often you'll find with professional theologians a high level of skepticism in them. They tend to, if you go on the spectrum, if you have folk theology over here, which is basically, unreflective, unquestioning of everything, the professional theologian, if they're not careful, can start to wonder about everything, because they're in that kind of mind frame of always thinking things through. And so they can tend to be skeptical people, but they're a healthy skepticism within the church. They're the ones that can rightly have the radar go off when things really are going astray. Now, their main job is to help ministerial theologians and lay theologians, and there is sometimes some overlap in these areas. So, for instance, a book like the book by Roger Olson that he wrote, that one would be kind of for like lay theologians and a little bit pastoral theologians as well. But he's directing that book more to not very beginner lay theologians, but he would be reflecting that one to people. Oh, is that buzzing that you're hearing? Yeah, you know what you have to do, Jim? You have to shut that light off. Yeah, or you can do that. But there's one light right there on the very end. Oh, Arthur, put that one. Yeah, now put the middle one on. There you go. It's the weirdest thing, but shutting that light off. Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, no problem. So where I'm saying there's this line is that obviously not every lay theologian is just in one category. There's a big spectrum of where people are at in their lay theology. So a book like Roger Olson's is targeting lay theologians, but they would be targeting lay theologians that have begun to start to go deeper in their faith. Me, I'm a pastor, so I teach people in churches, but I also have a doctorate, and I do teach at seminaries as well in a particular field. So in that field, which is in the whole area of homiletics and preaching and exegesis and things, I have more of a professional degree, and I train pastors. I go to places like Africa and Brazil and that, and even here in Edmonton or in the new year at Carey Theological Seminary, I will be doing professional theology for pastors. So there can be overlap here with the ministerial and pastoral theologian or professional theologians where they're sometimes doing both. The last one is academic theology. Now, academic theology is one that would be unhealthy, like the folk theology. We're going to find out time and time again when we get into actual doctrines, just like in this, that it's these guardrails, and that there's a spectrum in the middle that's healthy, and there's that tension that we hold as Christians, and it's the extremes that usually get us into danger. So academic theology is highly speculative. It's virtually all philosophical. These are the kinds of people sometimes that Time magazine loves to approach around Easter to maybe talk to them about Jesus. A lot of times these guys, they might not even be Christians. Why they went into theology, who knows? And they teach at some of the UBC or U of A, and they not only are highly skeptical, but they tend to even be quite hostile to even any kind of true, authentic faith. So it's usually quite detrimental to the church, this academic theology. Now, the warning for us in the lay theology is to make sure that just because we're finding something challenging doesn't mean it's academic theology. So there can be especially when we come right out of folk theology, and then we read something and it challenges some of our views, and you're like, I don't know, understand these. Oh, he's an academic, like he's just one of these way out there. And we have to be careful of that because we're making too big of a leap. Like I said, Roger Olson's book wouldn't even be considered something, I mean, Roger Olson's book would be something that might be assigned for first or second year university Bible school student. So it's at an introductory level, but it's going to challenge all of us because we don't do this enough in our churches and that. That book's not written for pastors. So academic theology is something that's just, like I said, completely harebrained, virtually philosophical, pretty much useless, often doesn't even believe in the scriptures or even God, and is very detrimental. So this here is what we talked about last week with these guardrails. And the folk, my PowerPoint, it's like it liked to shift everything when I put it on the new screen. Anyway, I should test it in here before because when I did it on my computer, the academic should be on that side. See how it kind of got bumped there? So somehow when I just Google Drive sent it over here, it shifted everything away. So if you could just visualize the academic on that side. What I was showing with this is that like the lay, the ministerial, and the professional, they're all going down the highway. They're all in that, what we'd call the guardrails. Now, this is different from different types of theology where there may be some different perspectives. This is actually more in regards to just where different people are or their gifts or their functions in the church. But it does still illustrate the same thing, that both the folk theology on the one side and the academic theology on the other side are a danger to the church and often have the church fall into heresy. So most people in the lay and even ministerial, half of the ministerial side on that side, have to be aware more of the danger of falling off the road on the folk theology side. So that's something that we are going to have to just constantly challenge ourselves on. If I was talking to a group of seminary professors, then the danger is going to be going too far on the other side because they want certain accolades in the academia world beyond even Bible schools and that. And so they start writing all these pointless papers to just try to get their name out there, and they have the danger of going the other way. So everyone's a theologian, as I said before. The question, again, is what kind of theologian are you? Are you a lay theologian, ministerial, or are you a professional theologian? And how are you going to be that kind of theologian and continue to develop as, let's say for us, as lay theologians? How are we going to work at continuing to become better and better lay theologians so that we can worship God and we can love one another and love Him and live out what it means to be His creation? And how do we protect ourselves from not falling into folk theology without, and here's the key thing, I mentioned before that a lot of this is also about character development. Theology is about that as well. Without the danger of moving along the spectrum in a healthy way, the danger is arrogance. The danger is for, as you become more and more of a good, healthy lay theologian, for you to look down your nose at all those really stupid folk theology people out there and how completely ridiculous they are and stupid, and why can anybody believe that? It's funny because I've even seen people that were adamant about certain beliefs, and then as they began to grow and began to see some of the fallacies in that, become some of the most militant and harsh people about anybody that had the beliefs that they used to have, which in some ways you can understand, but in some ways you're kind of like, look, it took you a while and it took some grace and it took time for you to get there. You can't expect other people in overnight or one conversation over coffee to get to where it took you 2 years of really working through this stuff, both intellectually and emotionally. So sometimes there is that pride that develops. Pastors and ministers can have pride over the lay people, and oh man, like, why do they not know so much, and why this and why that? And the same thing with seminary professors. I know, particularly for me, and this is really bad, and my wife has to constantly work on me, because my field and area is in the whole area of preaching, and I do a lot of teaching in the area, which involves marking and grading students. So anybody that's a teacher knows this. What's really hard for me is that hat is always being worn. When we're on holidays and I go to the church and the preacher gets up, I instantly go into a value, like what's his eye contact like? What are his gestures like? Like even things like that, like how many ums and ahs is he, and how's he exegeting the text, and what's he doing with this? And that's like, shut up, like, because I get in the car and I just start critiquing, and then she's like, did you get anything out of the sermon? So I have to force myself at times to be like, okay, I'm here to learn and to listen to God and not to be of value. There's a place for that, but this is not the place. So there's that pride that can happen. And I think all of us in all of our fields kind of understand that as we get better at certain things, we can then not be so gracious with people that haven't arrived there yet. So this is part of the thing that we're going to work through as we develop our lay theology and as we develop our understanding, is working through the angst that this is going to bring up, as it's going to challenge a lot of our folk theology, and working through our pride and ego as we begin to learn more and begin to recognize that not everybody around us has learned as much as we have, and to still be able to help bring people along, graciously talk to them, and to help them grow in their views, but to not become just people who are arrogant. The other important thing that all of this is going to help us do is help us understand the difference between what is a major issue and what are minor issues. See, folk theology often tends to major on the minors. So folk theology can major on things that either can be harmful or are open to debate. Whereas lay theology begins to recognize that the real issues that matter are the things that we need to go deeper in. And some of the other things that we can debate about aren't as important. And so that will also be part of the process too, as we go from folk to lay, is sorting out what's more important and what's less. John Calvin has this wonderful quote that, this is before the quote. Christian theology is about reflecting on and articulating the beliefs about God and the world that Christians share as followers of Jesus Christ. It's reflecting on, but not just reflecting on, it's about also articulating those beliefs that we're reflecting on. That's when we really begin to become lay theologians, is when we learn to articulate them. So we have to speak them out. So one thing that we're doing just as a staff, and I count David as staff even though he gets paid nothing, but he comes to our staff meetings. So we're going through this book on the Lord's Prayer right now, and the next 3 chapters, well 4, because I'm going to be doing 1 too, but everybody has to read, everybody's been assigned a chapter, they have to read it, and we come back and we discuss it, but they have to give a short little presentation of that chapter, of like what are the main points, what's being said. That's how you develop becoming a theologian as well, because you're not just thinking about it in your head and reflecting on it, you now have to articulate it. And in fact, what it does is when you can begin to articulate even views that you don't hold, but articulate it fairly. So for me to be able to, let's say we're talking about the whole issue of predestination and free will, I'm able to articulate what John Calvin actually believed about this, not some caricature that the Arminians say he believes. See, a lot of us, we learn the theology of someone else by reading their opponents. But if I actually understand and I read John Calvin himself, this is what he says. And then when I give Arminius' position on free will, I can actually articulate properly what Arminius says. Sometimes this drives my wife crazy because she wants to know where I land. And whichever one she takes, I'll say, well, Calvin would answer it this way. Well, Calvin would, and she's like, what do you think? And I'm like, well, Calvin would, and then she'd say, okay, well, then if I took them, no, but Arminius would say this, and Arminius would, I could try to put myself in their shoes to understand from their perspective what they're saying. Now, I do have a position, some of them I don't, but that's what becoming a lay theologian does. Doesn't mean you no longer have an opinion, but you want to fairly understand, because folk theology goes back into the stereotypes. It just writes off, Baptists, I mean, those guys they're just those crazy snake handler people down in the States. And I mean, don't Catholics basically worship Mary as the 4th member of the Trinity? Well, I guess it would be a quadrinity, or they have all these stereotypes about, which does not create dialogue, which is not true about what these people believe, but they're just slurs that are thrown around. Or maybe at a little bit more articulate level, we classify other people by what someone who doesn't believe them says about them. So we want to truly understand. Some of that is just loving our Christian brothers and sisters. Just because they're not in the room with you and because they lived 500 years ago, they're still part of your family. And so we want to at least first understand what people actually believed and why they believed it before we critique. So good theology is about the head, heart, and the hands. So this isn't all head stuff, because when we're doing this, we also are learning how to love. We're learning humility. We're learning how to hear and understand other people. We're learning how to be more gracious. We're also learning how to be sharper in our thinking. So it's about the heart, it's about the head, and it also motivates us to live and do and articulate what we believe, both in how we speak and how we act. Discipleship involves our wills, emotions, intuitions, attitudes, action, and our mind. In this way, this is what it means to love God with all your heart, mind, soul, strength, every other part of who you are, holistically. Good theology leads to living, loving, and worshiping God with our whole being. Good theology assists Christians in having lives grounded with a biblically informed Christian worldview. So this is this quote I have of John Calvin, and see, this is a classic case in point, that if you were to ask me if I'm a Calvinist, and what that means is Calvin's doctrine on predestination, because Calvin believed a lot more things than just that one issue. So if you were to ask me, are you a Calvinist? I would say, no, I don't believe predestination the way Calvin did. If you were also to ask me who's one of your favorite theologians, I would say John Calvin. Because I love so much of what he has to say, and I'm on board with so much of what he has to say. That's, again, one of these nuances that we have to, again, in our caricaturized world, if you're not a Calvinist, you just hate the guy. And if you're not an Arminian, he's just a heretic, which is such simplistic thinking. It's by people that have actually never spent any time with these people. So John Calvin, he has this wonderful quote in his Institutes that I have on my one of my bookshelves as a constant reminder of what he was trying to do and what I think is so right about what theology is about. He says, doctrine is not an affair of the tongue, but of life. It is not apprehended by the intellect and memory merely, like other branches of learning, but it is received only when it possesses a person's whole being. I love that. Most people never knew that Calvin would say something like that because they just thought he only talked about predestination. That's the only thing he ever talked about. And Calvin's saying, no, doctrine, when we understand what we're doing, it's like if you have somebody that you love, a friend or a spouse or a child, and you want to know everything about that person. And even in the midst of it, you know that you'll never fully understand another human being, but it doesn't stop you from still wanting to know more. And you know that when you love another human being, it's not just about learning intellectual things about them. Yeah, I want to know where Nancy was born and who her parents were and things like that, but it's also about every other part. It possesses the person's whole being. It becomes a joy. Even when you read people that you might not align yourself with, but you realize that this person is honestly wrestling with Scripture and trying to understand God, there's a certain beauty in just reading that and delighting in the fact that, wow, like who am I, even though I maybe disagree with them, but look at the effort and energy and output that he's doing or she's doing in trying to know this God better. And who am I to just be like, what a loser. I don't believe that. It possesses the whole being. So, we're going to end there.